Hello and welcome. I'm Dr. Dana Haggard, Professor of Management and curator of this video on evaluating narrative literature review articles. The purposes of this lecture are to increase your comfort in reading narrative literature reviews, increase your learning from them, and increase your ability to critically evaluate them for quality and credibility. As a reminder, narrative literature reviews are a type of non-empirical paper that provide narrative summaries and evaluations of the findings or theories within a literature base or body of literature. You will find that often the phrase literature review is used to mean either entire articles that are dedicated to reviewing a particular literature, or just a section of a paper that reviews the literature immediately relevant to a particular research question being studied. The APA tries to reduce confusion by using the phrase narrative literature review article to signify entire papers. I will try to use this phrase consistently when discussing articles rather than just article sections. But old habits can be hard to break, and I hope you will be able to tell from the context whether I am talking about an article or the section of an article. The APA tries to reduce confusion by using the phrase narrative literature review article to signify entire papers. I will try to use this phrase consistently when discussing articles rather than just article sections, but old habits can be hard to break, and I hope you will be able to tell from the context whether I am speaking about an article or an article section. This particular lecture will focus on narrative literature review articles, and we will save the discussion of literature reviews as a section for another lecture. The purpose of narrative literature review articles is to analyze the current state of knowledge or research in a particular area by taking a big picture look at what has already been done and helping the field move forward by identifying issues that had not been identified before and that should be dealt with in the future. The APA lists these 4 items as key criteria for narrative literature review articles: defining and clarifying a problem, summarizing previous investigations, identifying relations, contradictions, gaps, and/or inconsistencies, and suggesting next steps to solve the problem or problems. Narrative literature review articles are great sources of background because they summarize much of what is already known on topic and provide references for you to find more detail. Academy of Management Annals is one journal that specializes in publishing only narrative literature review articles. Several other journals also publish special issues dedicated to literature reviews. One of those is Journal of Management, and I have a review paper in it from several years ago on mentoring. I have posted it so you can see an example of this type of article, and I will use it as an article example as we continue this lecture. As I mentioned, literature review articles can give you a lot of information on a particular topic, and the more recent they are, the better for capturing the current state of knowledge. Often the word review is in the title of review articles, but not always, especially if the article is published in a journal or special issue of a journal that is specifically for publishing review articles. It's sort of assumed that if the article is in that journal, that it's going to be a review article. According to the APA's Journal of Article Reporting Standards, abstracts for literature review articles should contain 3 primary items. The first is the scope of the literature being examined. Scope is the specific topic of the article, but it also includes the breadth or narrowness of the literature being examined. For example, will the review examine only other journal articles? Will it include books, or will it include unpublished articles or papers? In other words, what are the limitations of the research reviewed? The second item is the period of time covered by the review. For example, will the review cover the last 5 years, the last 10 years, or a different time frame? And lastly, the abstract should mention the general conclusions reached in the review article. In other words, what important contributions have been made by the authors. Now let's take a minute to revisit one of the articles I have been using for an example in these lectures. This article is in a journal that publishes a variety of types of articles, so in order to help readers clearly identify it as a review article, we made sure to use the word review in the title. You'll notice that in the abstract, we talk about ourselves in the third person. The preference for first or third person comes from the individual journals and their style preferences. The scope of the article is mentioned in the title. We are looking specifically at definitions of the word mentor and how these definitions have impacted research. We're not looking at what contributes to mentoring, what causes it, or what its benefits are. We don't mention the limitations on the scope of the research types in our abstract, other than mentioning we are looking at empirical research, but we do give a detailed description in the body of the paper, and we'll take a look at that later. We state that we review how the construct or concept of a mentor has changed since the key article written by Cram in 1980, thus giving the time frame. We provide information on the contribution or general conclusions by stating that we identify core attributes of all mentoring relationships, and we make recommendations for specific information that researchers should be collecting about relationships. And of course, we have to mention research trends and directions for future research. If the authors have done a good job with their title and abstract, it should be easy to identify the articles as a narrative literature review. However, you will likely need to read further to know if the article is relevant to you or not. I tend to look for reasons to keep reading until I am clearly presented with a clear evidence that the article is not relevant to my search. Only then do I abandon it. I would always rather read an article and not need it than to not read an article that I do need. As we mentioned when discussing the general structure of an academic journal article, narrative literature reviews do not have the usual methods and results sections that empirical articles do. What you see here is a common outline you might see for a narrative literature review article, and it is different from the one I used earlier for the basic anatomy of an article. Keep in mind that introductions are not always labeled, and often the subheadings in the body of the paper are specific to the topics rather than general headings. To strategically skim a narrative literature review article, I recommend that you read the abstract and introduction carefully first. Then, if you cannot rule out the article as relevant, read the headings and subheadings until you get to the discussion, and then read it. If you cannot rule out the article as relevant to your interests after that, then go back and read it from start to finish. A good introduction should contain a roadmap of sorts to lead the reader to know how the author is going to proceed and how the article is going to unfold. As the article progresses, the author should provide some historical content using previous literature, and then break down the literature in a way that helps the reader see the focus and important points of interest in the article. I realize that methodish is not really a word, but it does a good job of conveying the idea that the narrative literature review article will likely contain statements regarding the approach the authors took to search for, find, and select articles to be included. For example, what databases were used, what search terms were used, and what outlets were used. And of course, what were the date range limitations. This brief description of a method section can be placed early in the introduction or later after some issues have been identified. Regardless, there should be a discussion after the issues have been identified, and the author should provide perspective and expert opinions on what researchers should do in the future to address the issues. Let's take a quick look at an example of what you might see going back to the mentoring review article. So this is a paragraph that appears early on in our review paper on mentoring, and it shows clearly that we are interested in empirical workplace mentoring articles. That means we're looking for empirical in that there was actual data collected and analyzed, that these mentoring relationships are workplace mentoring relationships and not mentoring relationships that might happen outside the workplace, and we're looking at articles rather than books or dissertations or those sorts of things. And also we're looking at those that were published in the time frame between 1980 to 2009. Furthermore, we're looking in primary journals for mentoring research. This means that we have identified out of all of the potential journals out there that would have articles published on this topic, we have narrowed it down to what we consider the primary ones, or the ones that you are most likely to find research on mentoring. And these also tend to be ones very well-known research publications. Academy of Management Journal, that's like the best one in the management field. Career Development International, Career Development Quarterly, Group and Organization Management, Journal of Applied Psychology, Journal of Applied Social Psychology, Journal of Management, Journal of Organizational Behavior, Journal of Vocational Behavior, and Personnel Psychology. These are all considered to be very good outlets for research on the topic of mentoring. Although we identified these as the journals we were interested in, we also used the PsycInfo database to actually search these journals. And we used it using the search terms mentor and protege. Only articles that directly assessed or directly measured a mentoring-related variable, so the presence of a mentor, someone's willingness to mentor, and a workplace context were included. We identified a total of 124 articles to include in our review. And then we show how we broke down these into 5-year timeframes, and we talk about what happens for the most common topics in each of those 5-year timeframes. And then after we go over that, we let you know that the section after that is going to provide our observations on the particular research topics, perspectives, and methodologies that were used across each of these time periods. So this is a visual summary of what we came up with, and you can see notable topics and developments in mentoring research across time. It starts down at 1980, goes all the way up to 2009, and you can see how we've kind of grouped the topics of interest or what was being studied related to mentoring in each of these time frames. And so when you see where the arrow starts, that's around the time frame where you see the initial work on those things. So each appearance of an arrow is where a new set of topics became of interest to mentoring researchers during that particular time frame. Even though we had things back here in 1980 that are started, that doesn't mean you never saw those again. That's just where they started. And then those are continuing to the present day. This table is where we made our recommendations about what information researchers should always be collecting about primary mentoring relationships. And so these are the things that after reviewing the literature, we realized that researchers were fairly inconsistent in gathering that information, so it made it difficult to make conclusions across those studies because we didn't always have full information. And so this is what we recommended should always be gathered as standard information whenever you're doing a study on mentoring in the workplace. Okay, and as with all articles, regardless of type, a narrative review should end with a description of the obvious and/or potential limitations of the research. For example, the authors might note that a review which covered a longer time span, or one that included books instead of just articles, might uncover new, clarifying, or even contradictory information. Regardless of the number or types of limitations to a study, something can always be learned. The important point is to remember that all research should be interpreted with caution, and the reader should be able to identify limitations and how those limitations can affect the usefulness of the research. Next, let's talk about the questions to ask yourself when you are evaluating the quality of a narrative literature review article. These should sound familiar as they are related to an earlier slide in this lecture. The first question to ask yourself is, do the authors clearly define the concepts or constructs to be reviewed? While the authors are usually writing to fellow researchers on the topic, they should still take the time to define important terms so that new readers can learn and understand from the review. The next issue can be harder to determine if the article you are reading is the first article you have read on the subject. Quality narrative literature reviews will include key articles, and those can be hard to spot if you haven't read other articles that reference them. The more you read on a topic, the more likely you are to be able to identify key articles and key authors because you will keep seeing their names and the article's titles cited in other papers. The Cram article from my mentoring review is an example. The great majority of articles on the topic will mention that particular Cram article or another article of hers because she is considered a key author or key researcher on the topic. There are others as well, like Reagan's, Scandura, Eby, and Turbin, and you will see their names often in mentoring articles. Another question to ask when trying to determine the quality of a literature review is, does the article identify new or under-researched relations, contradictions, gaps, or inconsistencies in the existing literature? Most of the time, the goal is to uncover connections that haven't been identified before or to call attention to a problem that no one has noticed before. However, sometimes authors also take what might have been mentioned before and highlight its relevance in such a way as to stimulate more thought and further research into the topic. The narrative review article should do more than just call attention to problems, though. It should also suggest reasonable next steps to solving the problem. A good article will include next steps and guidance future researchers can take. Sometimes the feasibility of these next steps will be easy to determine, even by a non-subject matter expert. But in some cases, to truly understand whether or not a suggestion is reasonable, you will need to be both a subject matter expert and to have research experience. Have the authors mentioned potential limitations of the research which might limit the usefulness of their research? And if so, how might this affect the usefulness of their research? And a last question here, but not the only one left you can ask, is what sort of citations and references does the author draw upon? It is not just a matter of making sure that they accurately present the research of others and properly give those others credit, but it is also about where they are getting their information from. So, how credible are the sources of information used to create the review? Do the journals, authors, and/or publishers cited have good reputations for producing trustworthy and accurate information? When it comes to evaluating a narrative literature review article, remember that they are like all research. All research falls on a continuum. Some will be more relevant than others, and some will be higher quality than others. As with all research, keep in mind that nothing can be proved in a single paper, but you can gain a wealth of knowledge from any one particular paper. That was a lot of information to process, so we will stop here for now. As most often, my two primary sources for this lecture were the APA Publication Manual and Evaluating Research by Frances Dane. I hope this lecture helped take a little of the mystery out of reading narrative review articles and increased your confidence in your ability to read and analyze articles of this type. If you have any questions about this lecture, please let me know by posting in the appropriate place on Blackboard. Thank you!